The moment that one loads up Dusk, text fills the side of the screen reminiscent of games from an age gone by. Even in the background, the slight whirring of an old machine can be heard. But that's the idea. Dusk seems to unabashedly recreate the shooter games of the 90s and bring them to modern audiences with its own take on the retro shooter genre. And from the first instant that the player has control of the character, it's apparent that this isn't the standard, relatively sluggish modern shooter game. Dusk was developed by a single man, David Szymanski, produced by Dave Oshry, and the music composed by Andrew Hulshult. And despite the small team, the game is charmingly entertaining and engaging, and plays its strengths well, delivering a shooter experience that many in our time just haven't been introduced yet. Dusk's story is paper-thin. The player has a reason to be doing the things he's doing, there's an explanation why this is all going on, and that's about it. Nothing is really deeply explored. Nothing fancy, nothing complex. It's clear that the focus is on the recreation of older-style shooter games, and a great deal of that relates to the idea that the narrative comes second to the experience of playing the game itself. In fact, David was inspired to make a game like Dusk because at one time he didn't have access to high-end computers, and a lot of his time was spent playing more simple, easy-to-run games like Half-Life and Doom. Quake was also an inspiration, and it's not at all hard to see that as you play the game. Dusk is fast, frantic, and engaging. The player zips around at a high speed, strafing to evade enemy attacks and zooming about while sliding, and with no care in the world any kind of realistic aspect we see in many modern games. It's very Arcady, and Dusk knows it, and it embraces it. Dusk doesn't try and trick you into thinking it's an old game by wearing the coat of paint and just going through the motions. It really does live and breathe its inspiration with a level of quality that surpasses many of its peers. Dusk is like a game out of time, but I mean that in the most positive of ways. The game features two modes, the campaign and endless. Endless is essentially choosing between a few maps and fighting off waves of enemies for points. The far more impressive of the two modes, and the one that will probably take up most of your time, is by far the campaign. Dusk's campaign lasts around 6 or so hours. It did for me, though I tend to take a game slower than the average player. I like to ogle the scenery, look for secrets. I don't rush games. It's a quality adventure that really feels like a journey, which is something that many games lack, I feel. There's certainly a sense of accomplishment that comes to you after you beat it, and as you progress from point to point, you feel like you're really working forwards to something and that you've come a long way. The campaign takes you from the quaint rural setting of the foothills to the mechanical facilities and then to the Lovecraftian nameless city, and each of the 3 episodes has a different aesthetic and feel to it, and the game certainly seems to give you an impression that you're descending further and further away from the normal world as you move from location to location, and in the end you find yourself enjoying a bizarre and otherworldly collection of creative scenarios that keep the game feeling fresh and interesting even far into its twilight moments. The abandonment of more familiar farmhouses and barns in the game's earlier levels as it descends into this stranger alien world with claustrophobic catacombs and floating islands with their mixture of logically impossible architecture and bloody gory imagery really does make you feel like, despite the game's very simple graphical style, you've gone into a place you certainly shouldn't be in and don't belong inside. And I think that's part of what makes this game so excellent, the fact that the simplicity of its aesthetic forced the developer to be creative and to get his mind working. You can see that there's a vision here that's being explained and given to the player to explore. He understands the scope of what he can do, and like many other indie and AA developers, he uses that as a strength instead of trying to do too much and ultimately failing or giving an experience that's really watered down, that doesn't really know what it wants to be. Dusk knows exactly what it wants to be. And it does it so well that I have a feeling in the future other games will want to be Dusk. The enemies themselves in Dusk are numerous and varied, from simple rats, robed fireball-throwing cultists, chainsaw-swinging farmers, possessed soldiers, invisible demons, and other strange monstrosities will fill the levels of the game and make it feel populated and real, or at least as real as a game of this genre can. Enemies are often arranged and aligned in ways that make absolutely no tactical sense, and they behave without any real sense of intelligence other than attacking the player, which is actually something that helps give the game its charm and makes it so fun. Dusk is the player's playground firstly, and no focus on the individual enemy in the world should come before that. Modern games often take this as a failure, where poor AI in an otherwise realistic or believable world tears the player away from their immersion, but in Dusk it comes off as the enemy simply being ferocious. This isn't about enemies trying to outsmart the player, it's about the player being able to, with their limited resources, defeat all these obstacles and keep going to the next level in the same way that 90s games did. Almost all enemy attacks against you that are ranged can be predicted and dodged, and using melee attacks can even reflect attacks back towards enemies who threw it. But the bullets and the fireballs and such that are thrown your way can all be dodged. You aren't just randomly hit by attacks. You can see them coming and can potentially evade them all. Similarly, while playing the game, I never felt like I was being punished for something that wasn't my fault. I wasn't put into a situation where I felt like I was going to fail by design, at least in the scripted sense. Enemies ambush you and pop out to attack you when you don't expect it many times, but it never felt like it was unfair in any way. Apart from one or two instances where teleporters might link me to a predetermined location where, just by coincidence, enemies happened to be at since they had followed me previously, which I can't blame the game much for. And add in the fact that the game has a generous offering of difficulties, I can certainly see Dusk as being a game that will encourage many devoted players to try again to complete at more challenging difficulties or at faster times. The weapons that the player has access to aren't too numerous, and they're not too few. They each fill their roles, and there is always a weapon for every scenario. The basic melee weapon is generally your backup. Pistols and shotguns can be dual-wielded if you find a pair of them. A short-range double-barrel super shotgun foils the long-range hunting rifle that can be zoomed. A crossbow that pierces enemies and walls is next to less precise weapons like the mortar and a cannon that shoots explosive rivets. As you play the game, you learn what weapons are best to kill what enemy, and taking advantage of this knowledge to save your ammunition for better guns for deadlier foes, as well as utilizing each weapon's strengths in different scenarios will help you get better and better, and do better and better. You can bounce grenades off walls, you can pop around walls with a super shotgun, you can strafe with the assault rifle, it's all just part of learning the game, like many others. But defeating enemies with your own weapons isn't all. Dusk is littered with throwable objects that inflict heavy damage to enemies. Boxes and saw blades fill the levels. Exploding barrels are placed everywhere so you can take advantage of them to defeat the baddies in whatever silly and creative ways you wish. Not only does it give you an opportunity to kill enemies without using ammunition, it adds to the variety of how you can enter combat if you wish to, as it's often satisfactory to kill all the enemies in front of you in a variety of ways, instead of just hosing them all down with an assault rifle. Crystals of madness create clouds of green smoke that force enemies to fight each other instead of you, and gas cans will explode and, blow up enemies, turn them into meaty chunks. Levels also feature power-ups, such as the Fast Fire Totem, which increases your rate of fire, and even a Serum of Blistering Heat, which causes time to crawl to nearly a standstill, and time only passes like normal when the player shoots or moves, like super hot. There are typical pickups in this game, as you would expect for the genre. Coins and other goodies will increase the player's morale, which is effectively your armor, which reduces your health damage taken by half. The player can interact with beds and other items to restore your health as well. And while there are health packs in the game, many enemies, when slain, will drop a health potion that will increase the player's health by a single point, and they'll add up over 100. So a skilled player can slowly build their health higher than the normal 100 if they take out enemies without being damaged. Last year, I bought Quake, the original. I played it through to the end, and it was a joy. It was a blast. Loved it. There was just something about it that pulls you in. It's like you stepped through a time portal to a day when games were just different. The simple mechanics, arcade combat, and relatively antiquated graphics, they weren't a hindrance on my enjoyment. They were charming, like an old Tomb Raider game or Descent or Terminal Velocity. Understanding that a game is old is something that only adds to its ability to be savored. Dusk honestly feels like it's pulled straight out of time, and it's done so well and with such quality that I'm happy it's been so well received. There are tons of people out there who have heard of Doom. They've heard of Quake, but how many have actually played them? Many of us roll our eyes when we talk about people who haven't suffered through the perils of playing Gravemind on legendary difficulty, but Halo 2 came out almost 15 years ago. Quake is from 1996. Doom is from 93. Dusk will be many players' first introduction into the experience of old games that for some of us may be nostalgia, but for them, it'll be a quality all its own. But I think that covers the basics of a game that's pretty much the basics itself as a shooter. Fun levels that are creative and interesting, meld with enjoyable weapons and a throwback aesthetic to create a fun and engaging shooter experience that any fan of Quake or Doom would love. Dusk is a labor of love, a project that shows passion and interest in creating a love letter to the shooter games that helped kick the industry off into what it is today. It's amazing what a dedicated and talented small team can do these days, and it's games like Dusk that keep me optimistic for the gaming industry going into the future. As AAA gaming companies continue to poop the proverbial bed, titles like Dusk will always be there for those of us who'd rather not go through the motions of fill-in-the-blank month's new, dull, AAA blockbuster release. Pretty graphics might fool some, but you'll have to do far more work to make a game that's actually fun.